Natalie, can you start recording now? Oh, you did. Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. We're excited you chose to take time out of your day to join us and learn from our colleagues out in the Midwest. My name is Patricia Kennedy, and I'm the program manager for California's Climate Assessment Tribal Program. I work for the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. So we, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, join you from what we now call Sacramento in California. The history of Sacramento area, the people, is rich in heritage, culture, and tradition. This area was and still is the tribal land of the Nisenan people. Sacramento was a gathering place for many local tribes who have lived throughout the Central Valley and the foothills for generations, and were the original stewards of this land. So we'd like to acknowledge the Southern Maidu people to the north, the Valley and Plains, Miwok and Miwok peoples to the south of the American River, and the Patwin-Wintu peoples to the west of the Sacramento River. We acknowledge that we're standing on the tribal lands of Sacramento's indigenous people. Beyond that, we acknowledge that our work spans the area we now refer to California, home to over 110 federally recognized tribes and over 70 non-federally recognized tribes. While we recognize also that we have a ways to go, we're working hard to strengthen our partnerships with California tribal communities, and hope you see that in some of the program details we shared today. Okay, next slide, please. So today we're going to be introducing, we're going to do welcoming and introductions. We're going to introduce the Tribal Advisory Group, provide space for any tribal leaders that might be on with us today to introduce themselves. I'll provide a brief overview of the tribal program under the climate assessment, really just to kind of for stage setting, why are we here, why are we having these conversations? And then I'll hand it over for the bulk of our presentation for our colleagues from Gliffwick and the College of Menominee Nation for our main presentation today. We hope to have some time following our discussion following the presentation for some discussion and Q&A. So the goal of today's meeting is really to share knowledge about how tribally led climate adaptation efforts have worked in other regions, and discuss how we can learn from these best practices in our own work here in California. All right, next slide, please. California's fourth climate assessment was the first time there was a report from tribal and indigenous communities within California. This work has guided our program in the fifth assessment and really allowed this entire program to be formed. I'd like to set the stage today with a quote from that report. It states, "This report is the beginning of something truly innovative, a mutual invitation between tribes in the state to share learning with an urgent focus on climate action, incorporating traditional knowledges and practices. This synthesis is the starting point of a new productive climate conversation between tribes in the state." So it's with this in the foundation that we're really kind of moving forward and taking this with us and setting the stage for what we're doing now and into the future. The assessment for California is the foundational climate change research that informs really a lot of the climate work we do here in California. We are honored to be partnering with our tribal communities to lift up tribal expertise and indigenous knowledge in this historically Western science-dominated field. We're excited to be supporting tribally led climate change research initiatives to address the critical needs of climate resilience and support the great work already underway in tribal communities. So we have like 5 main goals in the tribal research program. I'm going to keep it somewhat brief so we can get into the bulk of what we're here to talk about today. But our goals are to engage, consult, and partner with tribal communities to advance collaboration on indigenous knowledge and expertise, really ensure that these protected perspectives are included and needs are elevated. To establish and carry on a tribal advisory group to ensure collaboration on indigenous knowledge, to support tribally led research through a grant program, develop a synthesis report that will be authored by tribal representatives, and support the development of guidance on collaboration and protection of indigenous knowledge and tribal expertise through research processes and report handling. So we do invite you to join our mailing list, as we'll have many opportunities and some communication on each of these in the near horizon. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, with that, I'm honored to introduce our current tribal advisory group. We have representatives from both federally and non-federally recognized tribes with us, as well as representatives from a broad geographic and expertise range. The Tribal Advisory Group is dedicated to guiding our collaboration on Indigenous knowledge and tribal expertise throughout the fifth assessment. So I know not all of the Tribal Advisory Group members were able to join us today, but I'd like to take this time, if there are any members on with us today, if you are able to come off mute on video and introduce yourselves, we welcome that now.
Afternoon, Patricia. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, Mike. I can, yes.
Okay, I turned on my video and I don't see that, but I figure I would like to say hello to everyone today and glad you could make it. And looking forward to getting a little more insight on the adaptation menu. Thank you today for hosting this.
Perfect, Mike. Thank you. And I see Will, I see you're with us. I'm not sure if you're able to come off mute. No pressure if not. I just kind of wanted to lift you up if you are.
Thank you. Will Micklin. I'm a CEO for the William Pipe Band of Kumeyaay Indians. Robert Pinto, Senior Chairman. Michael Garcia, Vice Chairman. William Pipe is one of the 12 Kumeyaay bands in San Diego County. And the Kumeyaay are traditionally Tipai and Ipai clans. Ipai north of the San Diego River, Tipai south of the San Diego River, Aboriginal lands between the Pacific Ocean and the Chocolate Mountains in the deserts of San Diego County, Imperial County, and into northern Mexico. Weepipe is a Tipai clan. There's 5 Kumeyaay villages in northern Baja, Mexico, and so I'm not Kumeyaay. I'm Tlingit from Southeast Alaska, and thank you for the forum.
Thank you, Will. Really happy to have you on today. Ray, I see you on. Are you able to come off mute?
How's it going, everybody? Ray Gutierrez. I'm on the call. Glad to be here with everybody today. Yeah, I'm the ecocultural ecologist for the Waxahachie Indian tribe. We're from the southern Sierra Nevada in California. Much of our ancestral homelands is either in private hands or under the jurisdiction of the Forest Service Park Service. And really looking forward to see the adaptation menu and how we can apply it in our community.
Awesome, Ray. Thanks for being here. I think I saw Dean on. I'm not sure if I'm seeing him on still.
Yeah, this is Dean Tonina Monolake Quetzalcoatl tribe. We are a non-federally recognized tribe in the Eastern California, Eastern Sierra region, Mono Lake, Yosemite areas. And we see these opportunities as very important to learn from each other and to build upon ideas that are presented. It just helps us all. It gives us a boost in our own regions to learn what others have done. And we're doing 2 things here. We're doing a climate impact analysis, and at the same time, we want to be writing a climate adaptation plan. We don't know that they should follow one another or not. We just know that they both need to be done. So we're really excited to see how others have done it. And again, just glad to be here, and thank you all for coming.
Great, Dean. Really happy that you're able to make it. I'm doing a quick look. I don't see any other tribal advisory members. If I'm missing somebody, please just interrupt me. Oh, yep.
I was still trying to get my audio and video together earlier, so I didn't give a full introduction. I guess to give more of a background on, I'm with the Potter Valley Tribe, who's a Pomo tribe in the North Coast Range. We're located on the Eel River, the upper main stem of the Eel River watershed, and also on the eastern fork of the Russian River. I'm working with the tribe developing their water quality monitoring program and a climate adaptation plan and vulnerability assessment. And in the last 4 or 5 years, I was working with a Lake County tribe, Middletown Rancheria, on some of the climate impacts to the forest community. We had the wildfire impacts damage some of the trees, and the drought stress resulted in a large die-off due to western pine beetle infestations. So we worked with some of the Lake County tribes on dead tree removal, minimizing the spread of the western pine bark beetle, and then some on native plant revegetation. And thank you again for having this here today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike. As you can tell, I mean, this is just like a little snapshot of where everybody is. And I think this presentation is just really timely. I'd also like to take some time if there are any tribal elders or leaders on today to feel free, please. We welcome you to come off mute and video if you would like to introduce yourself, or anybody that would like to introduce themselves in the chat. I think that really just kind of helps us in this virtual world to be a little bit more connected. So if you feel comfortable, please introduce yourself in the chat. I'll give it just a minute to see if there's any elders or leaders on. Anybody I've missed? Don't be afraid to call me out. Okay, we'll move to the next slide. Okay, great. With that, let's dig right in. I'm really happy to introduce today 3 folks joining us from the Midwest to present on the Tribal Adaptation Menu. Sarah Smith is a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and is the Midwest Tribal Resilience Liaison with the College of Menominee Nation, the Sustainable Development Institute, in association with the Midwest Climate Adaptation Center, Science Adaptation Center. As the liaison for the Midwest, she works on facilitating stronger relationships between tribes, climate researchers, organizations, academic institutions, and the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. In addition, she works with tribes to build capacity and provide support on helping identify gaps and assisting with climate resilience efforts. Hannah Ponchi is a scientist with the Climate Change Program at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, or GLFWC. She uses both traditional and scientific ecological knowledge to look at the impacts of climate change, the impacts climate change will have on treaty resources on GLFWC's 11 member tribes rely. Ileana Alexander is a tribal climate adaptation specialist with GLFWC. In addition to joining the Tribal Adaptation Menu, or the TAM team, you might hear that thrown out a bit, and hosting presentations and workshops. They are also assisting with the creation of a ceded territory adaptation plan. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Hannah, Sarah, and Ileana.
All right. Segu Swapigu, Sarah Smith Yungiats, Oniotiaga Neio, Kalewagwaho Niwagadaloda. Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Smith. I'm the Midwest Tribal Resilience Liaison out of College Menominee Nation. And me, Hannah, and Ileana are here today to talk to you about the Tribal Adaptation Menu and what that all means. So before we get started, I want to point out the title of the menu itself, which is Toboggan Jigadeg Anishinaabe Izatwad. And a rough translation of this would be doing something the Anishinaabe way, or if you look at Anishinaabe itself, it talks about the original people. So doing something the original way, or given our original instructions. And This was a title given to us by a tribal elder. There really isn't a good way to translate a tribal climate adaptation menu into an Indigenous language. And so this was something that was given to us for our menu. So to kick this off, this menu is really stemming from the need for adaptation planning tools for tribes that integrate Indigenous knowledges, cultures, science, and perspectives with Western science as well. And there's this need to facilitate culturally appropriate climate adaptation between tribes and non-tribal partners. And we'll talk a lot more about this as well. And with our menu itself, it is actually a representation of a lot of different knowledges coming together. As you can see in the circle itself, that's our author team. And Patricia is actually on there. If you can see her name in there, she's one of our authors who was actually on the team before I started in my position. So we regard her as part of the Tam family as well, and one of the OGs that was one of the originals who started this. And so with this, we really wanted to showcase the authorship in a different way that isn't very traditional when you look at Western science, especially in publications. A lot of times you'll see in publications, you'll have your lead author and then your second author and so on. And with this menu, we were trying to figure out a way to better represent those who contributed to the document, and we decided to showcase it in this manner. When you look inside the document at how we would like the TAM to be cited, you'll see that the author itself is the Tribal Adaptation Menu team, because this was a collaborative effort and everybody brought some knowledge to the table. Since our publication in 2019, our team has actually won 2 awards, which is really cool. So the first award is the Climate Adaptation Leadership Award for natural resources in the tribal category. And then the second one was from the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership in 2022. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see a lot of the organizations that we authors represent. Some of us have changed positions, but these are the majority of our author team and where we are all coming from. This is just a snapshot of some of our author team. We don't have everybody on there, and it would be great to have a photo with all of us at one point. This was back in 2019 during the CALA Awards ceremony. And one of the things I like to point out with this photo is Josephine, who's the small girl in the background. In some of the slides, you'll see pictures of children at our workshops as well. And there were children at our planning meetings, at our writing sessions, and they were very essential to why we were doing this work as well, because we're thinking about those future generations, and it's good to have them in the room to remind us of why we're doing it, but also for them to hear what's going on, even if they might not comprehend everything we're saying. It's still a really good thing to have them in the room surrounded by what we're talking about. And 2 of our authors got the memo apparently to have matching outfits as well, which is always funny to see. So that's just a brief intro to the TAM. We're going to get a little bit more into it in a few slides, but I want to now talk about a bit of climate change in tribes and why this is so important to the work that we're doing. So this photo itself is actually from the Bay Mills Indian community up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And this is a really great example of coastal erosion that's actually happening. A lot of times when we think about coastal erosion, A lot of folks think about the East and West Coast, but we're having a lot of that in the Great Lakes as well. So this is one of the campgrounds they have, and there's been a ton of erosion that keeps pushing back this campground further and further inland, with a lot of that land being eroded and taken back into the Great Lakes. And so in the United States, there are over 700 or 574 federally recognized tribes. And then within that, there's also 60 state recognized tribes and countless tribes that have been disenfranchised by the government. And in California, there are a lot of tribes as well. And so each of them in California and everywhere else, each tribe specifically has their own climate change story. So we're here to share today, some of the stories, but each one has its own unique story to tell. The photos here depict the 2016 storm on the Bad River Reservation. So that's in northern Wisconsin. And this was a very intense storm that did a lot of damage to the reservation and to the infrastructure there. So as you can see, Highway 2 has been washed out. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is that these storms will happen more and more frequently, right? So this happened in 2016. Another one actually hit in 2018 as well in the same area. And it's really hard for tribes that have, maybe one or two major roads going in and out of their community. So during this event, there had to be helicopters flying people out for dialysis and other needs. And so this is really imperative when we're thinking about climate change, how it's affecting tribes, and how we're going to become resilient. So with tribes, and I'm guessing a lot of you know this already, but tribes depend on our non-human relatives to meet our spiritual, ceremonial, medicinal, subsistence, and economic needs. And one of the things that is different from others being affected by climate change is that tribes are stationary on their reservations or ceded territories, or trust lands, things like that. So we're not able to move with our relatives anymore on the landscape. And that's one of the big concerns, is that we are going to lose a lot of our relatives, and that we won't be able to have that connection anymore to meet these different needs. And when we talk about these relatives on the landscape, we talk about them as relatives and not as resources. According to a lot of our stories, we humans were the last ones on Earth. And so these relatives are our teachers and elders as well. And so when we think about them as our relatives and not our resources, our thoughts shift into a different kind of paradigm on how we're going to do this work on the landscape. And a lot of times decisions for our relatives were originally communal decisions made with the recognition and acknowledgement, reciprocity, and respect for those beings on the landscape. Today's management is more so top-down, made by individuals or agencies, institutions, without guidance from our non-human relatives. And we can see a lot of this on the landscape, from banning of cultural fire to things like wolf hunts, things such as those. And that's not how it used to be in the past. So with that, I'm going to throw it to Hannah to talk more about the vulnerability assessments.
Bonjour, everybody. Hannah Ponchi from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. I know the content of this assessment isn't applicable to California necessarily, but I just wanted to throw out our vulnerability assessment as an example of a way to look at climate change impacts on culturally important beings. We have two versions of our assessment. The one on the left was the first version we published in 2018. The one on the right, we just finished up this year and just started passing around to people. This assessment used both traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge to look at how climate change will impact culturally important beings in the ceded territories that we work in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And a vulnerability assessment, which it sounds like a few of you are in the midst of right now, is a great tool for using in this adaptation workbook process that we're going to describe in a little bit in step 2 in the workbook process. So we'll get into that in a little bit. So for our assessment, we interviewed knowledge holders and elders, and then also used, Western science and climate models to figure out which beings might be most affected by climate change. The title of our assessment is Anje Bumadazi Maguk Ao Aki, which loosely means the world is changing. And it does refer to the fact that, the world has always changed and will continue to change, but climate change fits into that. And most people that we interviewed, most of the elders and knowledge holders we talked to, referenced climate change, although they didn't necessarily use those words. So here's a quote from one of our Elective Lambo elders who referenced that. And so here's just a few examples of the kind of things we put in our assessment. There's a lot of ways to do vulnerability assessments, but we used the Climate Change Vulnerability Index, and then we ranked all of the beings we looked at according to their relative vulnerability. So this figure on the left shows kind of a best case on the left. The dot on the left is a best case scenario to worst case scenario on the right. So on the right is more vulnerable. So you can see Manuman, northern wild rice, the most vulnerable being in our assessment. The images on the lower right are from the Wabu's page, or snowshoe hare. So we have a range map, a photo, and then a graph showing their vulnerability using those same categories from that vulnerability index. So less, moderately, highly, or extremely vulnerable in the best case and worst case climate change scenario. And this kind of assessment allows you to look at which aspects of a being's natural history and life make it vulnerable to climate change. And that will really help if you're doing adaptation planning to target exactly how you can help each being. Go ahead, Sarah. So we also looked, just as another example, we also looked at different categories of beings commonly used by Ojibwe people in our area. And we can go ahead. We found that swimmers and plants are the most vulnerable beings. So this kind of approach can be helpful in adaptation planning too, to see where you might want to prioritize adaptation actions. Go ahead. Okay, so we know that these culturally important beings, everywhere, are moving, shifting their ranges, many declining due to climate change. And as Sarah mentioned already, the tribal homelands, reservations, ceded territories are all fixed in place. And so this loss of access to culturally important beings and the reciprocal relationships that have been maintained since time immemorial is a huge threat to Indigenous culture and community. And so this is where a huge need for climate change adaptation actions that are culturally appropriate and community supported come in. And that's what the Tribal Adaptation Menu tries to help with. And back to Sarah.
All right, so talking more on the TAM beginnings and how it all started. This is a photo, actually, kind of like the inception of the Tribal Adaptation Menu. This was taken back in the spring of 2017. NIAX, which is the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, they were holding a workshop on forested watersheds with climate change in Minocqua, Wisconsin. And during these workshops, very similar to the ones that we put on, they encourage people to bring projects to work on. And so the folks in this photo brought a project looking at wild rice restoration. That was to use the forested watersheds workbook a menu that NIAX created. And during this workshop, the idea for a tribal focused menu was kind of spurred. Although the menu they did have on forested watersheds was really good, there was this need for Indigenous perspectives and knowledge on how to do climate change through a tribal lens. And so this idea for the TAM began at this workshop, and 2 years later, we were able to publish it. So Indigenous perspectives call for observation, recognizing and learning from our first teachers or our elders on the landscape. And adaptation in this context really addresses the responsibility and reciprocity to all our relations on the landscape. And that's very different from a more Western perspective on emphasizing control and management of these non-sentient resources. And so this menu itself really offers that different perspective on adaptation and really shifts people's paradigms when they think about how to do work on the landscape in this kind of context. So this tribal adaptation menu was primarily developed for the use in Indigenous communities, mainly with tribal natural resource staff and others, but it was also for non-Indigenous partners as well. So this menu is really looking to help bridge communication barriers for non-tribal persons or organizations that are interested in Indigenous approaches to climate adaptation. So this really helps bridge that gap and build partnerships that are reciprocal and respectful to each party. And it's designed to be used across diverse ecosystems, different scales, management contexts, and values, really depending on what you're trying to look at with the climate lens. And so with the menu itself, this was based mainly on Ojibwe and Menominee perspectives, including language and culture and values within it. And while we were writing this menu, we intentionally designed it to be adaptable by other Indigenous communities to allow them to incorporate their language, knowledge, and culture, especially since we have a very, what is now the Midwest focus. It doesn't really include things like sea level rise or drought like in the Southwest, or different issues that we might not be facing up here. And so that's why we wanted it to be very adaptable so it could be used for other Indigenous communities, not just up here. Back to Hannah.
Oh, yes. Okay, so a little tour of adaptation menus and how they work. There's my son Soren in the picture that Rob, who couldn't make it today after all, is holding. We'll cover the basics of an adaptation menu and the adaptation workbook, and then the adaptation menu will make a little bit more sense. Go ahead. So, we're looking for culturally appropriate adaptation actions, but of course that can mean different things for every tribe, every agency, every landowner. There's no one approach to climate adaptation, and that's why we have these menus. Adaptation decisions depend on a ton of things: goals, values, culture, location, resources, all of those things. Go ahead. Okay, so a menu is just like it sounds. When you go to a restaurant and look at a menu, you don't order everything. You choose what works for you. These menus are the same. You can go through the options that are in there and choose what works for you and your goals for your land. Ideas in the menus are grouped into categories, kind of like a restaurant menu, appetizers and drinks. Instead, we have, wildlife and forestry and things like that. So you can choose some from each category, one category, or a mix of both. Go ahead. So this format also allows you to connect broad ideas to specific actions. So the menu is organized with this structure with strategies and approaches. And then we have example tactics, and those are the specific actions that will be taken. So we have strategies and approaches in the menu, and then we also have example tactics that you can choose, or you can, invent any of your own tactics as well. And the menus also help communicate ideas and boost creativity by organizing your thinking into different categories. And then all of the examples we have throughout there can open your eyes to the range of ideas that might be possible for climate adaptation. So menus are used as part of this whole process called the Adaptation Workbook, which is a process that the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science put out. So this is the five-step process, starting with your objectives for your area, assessing the climate impacts there, which is where that vulnerability assessment that you're working on would come in really handy. Then evaluating your objectives again, given the expected climate changes for your region, and then brainstorming adaptation actions. And that is the step where you would use a menu. NIAX has produced a lot of different menus. There's a forestry menu, an agriculture menu, the forested watershed menu we mentioned, a wildlife menu, and now we also have this tribal adaptation menu that fits also in that step 4. Then there's step 5, monitor your actions, make sure they're working. If they're not, it feeds you right back into step 1 to start over. Go ahead. So we'll give you back to Sarah here.
So one of the unique things with our menu is that it actually starts off with these guiding principles. And these guiding principles really are a framework on how to integrate Indigenous and traditional knowledges, culture and language into climate adaptation planning. And with these principles, they provide a general guidance for non-tribal partners as well working in Indigenous communities. And this section of the menu is also very adaptable as well, as we recognize that the customs and culture we have up here may not be applicable to other tribes and Indigenous communities. And so we really wanted to focus on empowering tribal communities with restoring language and culture and promoting tribal sovereignty by making this adaptable and encouraging those cultures and values to be incorporated in a document such as this. And I will throw it to Ileana.
All right, yeah, hi, Ileana Alexander. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the Tribal Climate Adaptation Specialist. And I'm just gonna walk us through some of the strategies today. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So why a tribal climate adaptation menu? Sarah and Hannah have both touched on this a little bit already. Not all of the existing frameworks work really well for tribal communities, for tribal leaders. And sometimes, a tribal DNR department just doesn't have the time or the capacity or the thinking space to 100% whole cloth recreate their own strategy and structure. And so we wanted to provide a framework for tribes to then take. And instead of starting from step 1, they can start from step 3 or 4 or 5. And a really good example of that is over here on the left, a strategy from the forest adaptation menu, preventing the introduction and establishment of invasive plant species and removing existing invasive species. And then their approach, the language they use in this, eradicating existing populations of invasive plants through physical or chemical treatments. While that action may be appropriate, the way they're going about it and their language may not be appropriate for a tribe seeking to do something similar or an action in parallel. So with the tribal adaptation menu, we have the opportunity to integrate language to discuss with the community. We have invasive sea lampreys. What should we be doing? We have a species that has its instructions from the creator, and it is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, just in the wrong location, and it's starting to throw things out of balance. So instead of using language like eradicating and just sort of getting rid of a species that still has intrinsic value, we can put a name to these beings. In Ojibwe-Moan, it's Bakan Ngoji Ga Ondadag. So those are our non-local beings. It's imparting respect onto those individual beings. And while the end result may be the same, going through chemical treatments, physically pulling out weeds, or other similar actions, we're adding that cultural element of respect for the being, of letting that being know what we're doing, why we're doing it, and going about it in a culturally responsive manner. Next slide. So we have these list of strategies, sort of that top-down, really broad, big ideas. And there will be a link at the end of the slides if you want to peruse the strategies a little bit more in depth. I'm going to talk about the first three. Next slide. So that first strategy, consider cultural practices and seek spiritual guidance. This is just sort of a good first step. I think a lot of tribal staff and leaders sort of already know this step, but it's a really good reminder for partners with the Forest Service, with state DNR, who maybe don't have that as part of their framework, to really consider, who are the cultural leaders, who are the key community members? Are they reaching out to just the people that they think they should be, or are they reaching out to elders and to people who can point them in the right direction? It's also a good reminder for these partners to think about what the human history is in the community, what the landscape history is, and be really mindful about those relationships and the relationship those agencies have, and whether or not they've sort of built up trust. How are they going into these communities? And are they doing it in sort of a positive and helpful manner? And then if you look at that picture on the right, that's pulled directly out of our adaptation menu. Strategy number 2 is learn through careful and respectful observation. So we have black ash that are in decline. We haven't quite seen the emerald ash borer yet, but through a series of drought, of other insects, we are starting to see a decline. And there has been sort of a big rush to how do we step in and prevent it? And strategy number 2 is a good reminder that inaction is still action. You can take a step back and learn and observe from these beings how they are changing before taking that next step forward and choosing an action. Next slide, please. And strategy number 3 is support tribal engagement in the environment. And so this can be through revitalizing traditional relationships and uses for different beings, getting youth out in the community, getting them in contact with harvesters, with elders, with partners. It could mean increasing tribal access on Forest Service lands, getting access to state parks without having to pay additional permits. It can be getting those partners together with tribal DNR and looking at what existing monitoring programs there are, and how can these sort of efforts be joined together instead of working in separate silos. And I think I'm going to pass it off to Hannah, who's going to talk about the TFPA workshops, which are these strategies in action.
Right, and so we'll give you an overview of how it's been used so far since we published it in 2019. Go ahead, Sarah. We've had over 50 projects, although I think that number is a little old. I think it's well beyond that now. In the Midwest, the Northeast, other regions, we've had interest from other countries as well. So that number is growing quickly. Go ahead. These are just pictures of all of our workshops that we've done since 2019. I think we've done 9. We go through that 5-step process that was mentioned in the earlier in the adaptation workbook. It's usually a 2.5-day workshop, which is long, but we feel like it's worth it to take the time to sit with the ideas, talk through them, and to take the time that it deserves. So we take you through each step of that adaptation workbook process, while always emphasizing the Indigenous perspective. Usually we have 5 or 6 people bring a project, or if you don't, you get paired up with a project group to help them out. All right, and you'll notice kids in every single picture, I think, as Sarah mentioned. We always have some kids running around. Go ahead. And then recently we've been doing these TFPA workshops. This was our most recent one in Bad River. TFPA is the Tribal Forest Protection Act. Go ahead, one more slide. Yeah. And so we've been using this same Tribal Adaptation Menu workbook, or adaptation workbook process, and the TAM with this TFPA. And so I'm going to explain it just a little bit because I know we want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So I'm just going to gloss over this. If you're interested in it, please reach out to us and we can talk a little bit more about it. But it's a special authority that allows a federally recognized tribe to directly propose projects on Forest Service land. You'll notice in the middle, it talks about what land qualifies, borders, or is adjacent to Indian Trust land. So adjacent has a star because that can mean a lot of things. That can mean in the same watershed. That can mean upstream. That can mean a lot of different things. So we can take that word and really expand it, and we've done that. Like within the ceded territories, we've used that definition. And then you identify some risk to that land, which climate change could be one of those risks, of many. So there's a lot of different routes you can take, but this TFPA, this authority has been increasingly used, especially very recently. It was used a little bit more in the past out west, and now we're taking it, using our adaptation menu and proposing a lot of TFPA projects in our area. So this could be a really good route for a lot of tribes. So in these workshops, we try to improve relationships between tribes and Forest Service, which is always helpful, improve communication, foster understanding. At our workshops, we have the tribes lead the project, the process. They host the workshop, they come up with the ideas, and then we choose Forest Service staff that would help support them and invite them to the workshop, and then have the Forest Service staff work through the project with them at the meeting, and then support them in the TFPA proposal process too. Go ahead. Just a really quick example project that's come through here. So Ishkode, or cultural fire, Minan, or blueberries in the Little Plains area. This is on the Huron-Manistee Forest on the eastern upper peninsula of Michigan. So reintroducing cultural fire on the forest, with the leadership of the Sioux tribe. So looking at doing some reconstruction of fire history in the past, and then reintroducing this low intensity fire with the guidance of the tribes. And this was a TFPA proposal that was put together and already funded. So just an example. And I think this was a pretty big project. I can't quite remember, but these aren't just small projects we're talking. These can be really, really big projects. So if you're interested in that at all, please reach out to us for more information or ask a question too. So Miigwech Bizendawieg, thank you for listening. Here are our email addresses as well as the link to the Tribal Adaptation Menu and QR code for the menu if you're interested in looking at it. So Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Hannah, Sarah, and Ileana. Really wonderful presentation. There's a lot of links in the chat. We have time for some conversations or some questions. If anybody has any, you can feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you. If you have anything in the chat that you would like to ask.
And we did really zoom through that. So
Yeah.
please, if you are still sort of percolating and the questions don't come till later, reach out, email us, always available.
Awesome. Thank you, Ileana. Shasta, I see your hand raised.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation and the wonderful work you do. I've seen some of it before, but it's wonderful to hear it directly from the three of you who have worked on this. And my question is, it looks like you've done a lot of work with some of the tribes in your more kind of local state area up there around the Great Lakes. And I'm wondering if you have any plans or ideas for spreading this to other parts of the US or even Canada.
Yeah, so we actually have a workshop that got postponed till next year down in Oklahoma. So that'll be kind of our first workshop outside of our region, which is very exciting. And we also have a training in November. It's called the Train the Trainer Workshop, where we're going to be trying to train new facilitators in order for them to have these workshops in other regions. Since our team is somewhat small, it's really hard for us to be everywhere, even though we would love to be. And so our hope is by training facilitators on this menu, more of these workshops can happen in the other regions.
You hear that, Patricia? We need to bring them out to California. Just saying.
And I will say there has been a lot of interest in part through the Midwest cask that Sarah works really closely with, from the Northwest cask and from universities like Oregon State and University of Washington.
Awesome,
yeah,
thanks.
Okay. Yeah, and there's interest for it internationally as well. I think we're trying to figure out how to do that because most of our positions, we don't work internationally. So I think that's something we're trying to figure out for in the future.
Great, thank you. Raymond, I see your hand.
Hey, Patricia, is the train the trainer something that we can do as tag members?
Yeah, Hannah, Sarah, Ileana, are there open seats for the Train the Trainers, or how are you accepting spots for that? If we're like, if there is funding, or maybe that's a discussion to have offline, but it seems like there might be interest.
Yeah, so this will be kind of like our first Train the Trainer in November. And we're trying to keep it a bit small since it's our first one. We do have hopes to have a second one next year, which will expand out to those who are interested. So I would suggest, sending us an email if you are, or Patricia, so that can be on our radar.
I definitely think if we looked at it for the Tribal Advisory Group members, if there is that opportunity or that space, we could see about supporting that through the advisory group as well. I agree. What Raven is doing looks like a lot of fun. I want to be there right now. Which I love it. I love this space where we can be interactive and just doing what we're doing, right? There was something else I was going to say. Oh gosh, I missed it. Shoot. Oh, I think if we're looking for resources as well, I want to make a little plug that we currently do have our grant program open, the Tribal Research Grant Program through the climate assessment. And one of the funding categories is information sharing. And it's really focused on climate planning and resilience in tribal communities, right? So if this is something that that you're interested in, I might just make that little plug, and we can put the link for that grant solicitation in the chat too. Any other questions? It seems like there's a lot of interest and folks are going to start really digging in, but we're here a few more minutes if there's any more questions or.
I have a quick question, if I may.
Please, yeah.
Turn my camera on. Well, it's actually just a few months ago, the National Tribal Lands Conference was here in Southern California. It's a big, big conference, and a lot of folks from Minnesota, actually, because I think the last one was held in Minnesota. Have you ever given this presentation in a place like that with a conference, a national conference?
We have. So I think oh my goodness, it was the last one we did that was national. I know we've presented to the National Native American Fish and Wildlife Society Conference. We've presented at the National Adaptation Forum a while back before COVID. We also presented at the National Tribes and Indigenous Climate Conference as well. Hannah, do you know, or can you remember any other national ones we presented at?
That's all I can remember, but yeah, we're definitely open to doing more presentations. If you guys have another group that you think would be a good audience, just reach out to us.
Thank you. And I also just really want to emphasize, I know we're right at time, but if anybody has a few more minutes, we can stay on. And I really want to emphasize the in-person meeting, that workshop. It's 2 days. It sounds like it's long, but super meaningful. And if this is something you're interested in, just really kind of being mindful to take that space, because from my experience, something just like really magical happens in that time, right? We're fitting so much in a small amount of time these days that I just kind of want to lift that up. It seems like a lot, but it's really meaningful work. Mike, I saw your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question, I guess, but it's a regional issue. This last spring and summer, we had the fires in Canada, which is a little bit to your north. So due to those recent wildfire effects, did that cause you to reevaluate any of your determinations in your recent vulnerability assessments?
We definitely touch on fire a little bit in our vulnerability assessment. You know, this isn't an area that has huge fires like out west, but yeah, definitely historically was burned. And you know, as that example project I showed you, still are a lot of efforts to reintroduce fire. But yeah, it definitely impacted us like everywhere. Had smoky days and thinking about it more. So yeah.
And I will say, I think our environmental health concerns kind of spiked. I'm originally from Oregon, and I spent a lot of my time growing up in California, and my family actually left Northern California after the Carr Fire. So I think this was something already sort of high on my radar. But I think for a lot of, especially for the 11 tribes that Glyphwick represents, it sort of piqued an environmental health interest, which I know Paula Band of Mission Indians, Shasta was on earlier. They had a really great environmental health forum sort of conference where they touched on those specific ideas. So especially if you have like that kind of information, I got a lot of really good resources. Sharing those out in the community does like a lot for capacity building.
I do think too that that Paula's hosting the tribal health. Oh, I don't remember the title. The forum that you were talking about the beginning of November. So that is coming. And
oh yeah, and thank you, Lori, for popping that in the chat. That was
perfect.
Oh gosh, was that 2 years ago I went? It was a fantastic conference. I would recommend it if you can get out there.
Cool. Well, hey, you know, my email's in the link or in the chat. If anybody would like to, I can help connect you to Hannah, Sarah, and Ileana. And they've also provided their contacts, but really here and open for the discussion and really appreciate you all coming this afternoon and spending your time with us and sharing your knowledge with us, and everybody else taking the time out of your day to be here in this space. And hopefully we can continue to have these conversations. I am also always available. So anytime you want to reach out, even if it's just to connect with somebody else, I'm here for it.
A question.
Yeah.
This is Rowena Yeager. I work for the Forest Service, and I was just wondering, Sarah, if any of you that did the climate adaptation menu, did you share this with your local, your land management agencies? Did they actually use it for any kind of land management decisions?
I think the projects have been primarily tribally led, but we've had a lot of partners come and learn a lot just in the workshop, you know, over the course of the 2.5 days. I think it exposes them to a lot of ideas that are uncomfortable for them and unfamiliar to them. And so I think people come out of those workshops as partners, you know, much more educated about tribes. And yeah, we've had definitely people supporting tribes in these projects. So I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Sarah.
Yeah, I would say that there was a really cool project that came out of a partnership with the Park Service. It's called the Minnesota Project. And if I can put it in the chat for you. That was a really great collaboration with the tribes and the Park Service, putting that together. With also like UW Extension was part of it as well.
I know that there's a lot of forests that we have here in California who really would like to incorporate a lot of tribal values in some of their land management decisions. And I think having one of these tribal adaptation menus would be a very good tool that they could use for not only the Park Service and the Forest Service, but, you know, even any, you know, state parks and stuff like that. Because, you know, there's a lot of tribes whose indigenous land is on Forest Service. So I just didn't know if that was something that was really, that was uniquely shared with any of the land agencies.
Yeah, and we often refer people to the menu just to read it, and especially the guiding principles section, which talks a lot about how to work with tribes in a respectful way. So it's a really good resource to share with people, just for that part.
Yeah, and I know we've done presentations for, I know we did one specifically for the Forest Service and other agencies as well that are kind of like land managers too. So we do a lot of presentations. But yeah, we also have them for those sets of people too.
Okay, and I know folks are dropping. We're 7 minutes over. I do want to say that we'll share this recording, we'll share the presentations and contact information following this. In the honor of everybody's time, though, I'm going to just say thank you so much. We really appreciate you. It's so wonderful to see your faces and hear your voices, and Ileana, to meet you. So we really appreciate you and your time, and everybody that was able to join us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll be in touch.